feel free to be what I want to be. I just need to be stronger. Been living every day in fear that I've lost my bliss. Help me out, for this doesn't work any longer. I have to be stronger. On and on and on in vain. Answer with the same refrain. No gain. Take a little break, hold up and wait. I need a place for some mental space. I must try what I stand for. And every time I show the cure to my status quo, we can go and go out and wide up a new door. And then we explore. On and on and on in vain. Answer with the same refrain. And on it seems. We're wasting life to live our dreams with no gain. I have tried on my own, but I can't heal our life alone. We're welded, we are one. Take a little turn and hear me out. There are ways to be, there are things to see that can change it tomorrow. Is there any use in singing songs if it's just the blues about a million dues that I'm hoping someday somebody will pay? On and on and on in vain. Answer with the same refrain. Let us make a change today. And maybe there will be a way for us. I have tried on
Good morning.
my own, believing I
Hello, good morning, everyone. Good morning, good morning. Welcome. Welcome to the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here bright and early for poetry. Yes, Dionne Brand is the author of much more than poetry, but as I think you know, this morning's panel focuses on poems. My name is Shivanee Ramlochan, and I'm delighted and honored to be in conversation with Dionne Brand today, about whom I will tell you just a bit. I think most of you know, but Dionne is the award-winning author of 23 books of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. Her 12 books of poetry, 4-Day Morning, 1978, Earth Magic, 1980, for children, Primitive Offense, 1982, Winter Epigrams and Epigrams to Ernesto Cardenal in Defense of Claudia, 1983, Chronicles of the Hostile Sun, 1984, No Language is Neutral, 1990, Land to Light On, 1997, there's glare, Thirsty, 2002, Inventory, 2006, Ossuaries, 2010, The Blue Clerk, Ara Poetica in 59 Versos, 2018, and Nomenclature for the Time Being, 2022, have won the Pat Lowther Memorial Award for Poetry, the Governor General's Award for English Language Poetry, the Trillium Book Award, and the Griffin Poetry Prize. In addition to poetry, Brand has published 6 works of fiction and 5 works of nonfiction. Brand is the recipient of the Toronto Book Award 2006 and 2019, the Blue Metropolis Violet Prize, the OCM Bocas Prize for Fiction, and the 2021 Wyndham Campbell Prize for Fiction. In 2017, Brand was named to the Order of Canada. She was poetry editor at McClelland and Stewart from 2014 to 2021. Please welcome her again. And Dionne will begin this morning with a reading from Nomenclature.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. The apocalyptic reports have come true, dilute in our arterial solvent. The atrocities saturate our latent notebooks. We stay awake, lambent. There are iridium rectangles under our tables. We meet, languid, nauseous, transfused presently for a few decades, chronic, venous, insufficient, the intervals of talk speed to nothing. And we've become scientists of without, under force, out of water, across loading, with bearings of us. Nothing will come of our innocence. You know that. After all, no discoveries in old texts, no modern symmetries, no revelations, no wisdoms to be admired, messages to be deciphered, smuggled to each generation, or so prescient they require philosophers. There were no clandestine works. There are no secret hallways waiting for the transcriber of great portents. It's simple. The wars they recorded were the wars they won. Let me be plain with you. These portraitures are portraitures of what we suspect. The insoluble facts are these, then: no one carried their writings across a river in a ringed cloth on the head, or sewn into the precious fold of a hem. No one buried them in a desert to wait for a coruscating time. The illuminated manuscripts are just the gaudy sacredness of violence. The electronic leeches downloaded their data bulk. I, for one, understood this eventually. My tendons were xenolith by then, of course, the tectonic plates zigzagging, shivering against us. There was that time in a room on Calle Nueva when the world crushed my chest like the world, like a boulder. As if the world were a boulder, as if gravity knitted sternum to finger, to hill, to lip, to thread, to floor, to chair, to boat, to gull, to Calle Nueva Alta, to thought, to hem, to a bus, to 3 note pencils, to umbrella, to foot, to insect, to jaw, to stem, to M8 Laguna Nebula, to Deneb, to fish, to velocity, to sheet, to wing, to light socket, to metal rail, to postage, as if gravity melted oxygen tank, to grief, to hip, to shoreline, to chair, to drinking glass, to green light, to xiphoid, to November, to tailpipe, to insect, to transcriptome. I know everything. I'm not innocent. Thank you.
Thank you, Dionne. Many of you joined us at the Big Black Box last night for the 25th anniversary celebration of At the Full and Change of the Moon. And regarding the audience, as those readings took place, it became very apparent to me what has been apparent for a long time, that many of us there in that space last night, and many of us in this room today, have long had a personal and deeply intense relationship with the work of Dionne Brand that has its own entanglements, rivers, vines, and tendrils that have nothing to do with me. And so I feel immensely fortunate to be allowed to guide and share in this conversation today, knowing as I do so, I sit in a room that is enlivened by Brand's poetries and the places they've been. So thank you all for being here in this moment with us.
Thank you.
Dionne, Nomenclature gathers a book-length poem, Nomenclature, along 8 other collections of poetry, introduced with a critical introduction by Christina Sharp. And as we think of this body of work of 40 years, I thought we might first attend to the here-ness of the moment that we're in, specifically how these poetries, yours and others, can and do live in a world alongside war and degradation. The wars persist The horrors persist, but so too do the poetries. Can we speak to this?
Yeah, I think that poetry is a kind of necessary practice, and comes up precisely to counter those other languages, the language of war, the genocide we are seeing enacted in Gaza, in Sudan. I think that poetry of necessity is produced out of these. And why? Because it breaks language, it opens spaces, it produces the possibility of another world, right? And so we are cordoned off, in a sense, by violence, and violence produced through capital. And we who come from these Americas understand that as a long process, understand its duration, and therefore it is necessarily present as another way of speaking, as another way of living in the world, right? Just as all of the musics we've produced in these Americas were necessary to have us leap out of that space. Just like steel band is necessary to leap out of a certain kind of stricture, just as calypso is necessary, just as reggae is necessary, just as the blues or jazz is necessary to have us leap out of these, these dreadful, violent processes that we live. And so I think, it's odd that poetry is often represented as minor, but actually its very persistence suggests that it is not. Yeah. So it is a way of thinking, a way of producing new meaning through language and breaking the very language that constricts us constantly.
I think it's impossible to speak about the wars that we see without also speaking about desire and its calculations. And across these 40 years of poems, desire has been mapped and unmapped, spooled and rethreaded. I will always remember the speaker towards the end of No Language is Neutral, speaking of her desire, saying, I have in fact been to this place before in desire. I recognize myself here as a body of desire. In that case, the desire of other women, the desire of all forms and shapes, sexual and otherwise, spiritual, carnal, economical, you'll find them in here. They have their roots in the poems here. And so, Dionne, I wonder, in relation to that, have the tools with which you've shaped this desire, how have they changed? Or how have you found yourself changing, wielding them from book to book?
Well, each book is another kind of exercise in shape and language. I move from book to book, and each book contains its failure to completely articulate the sense of being, right? And so each book is a kind of practice of working differently in language and understanding where language fails and trying to move to the next level of undoing, if you will. So when I look at each of those books in the collection, I can see the different shapes that I try to make. Yeah, each the first book there is slender, or the text is slender. because I wanted to be very, very precise. I wanted to limit that, limit the language and limit the line. The next book is spread all over the page, if you will. The next one works on a kind of three-line, a tercet stanza. So all of them are practices in form and idea, and which idea might fit into which form, or which form might be appropriate for which idea. So each one of them is a kind of study in thinking. One of them is produced after the war in Grenada, and all of them have something to do with what is going on in the world. What are we living, right? All of them have a woman on the page. There's a woman on every page, as they say, of the text, and that woman is trying to articulate the self, if you will, and how to live in fullness against stricture.
And the woman, the speaker we meet in Nomenclature, which begins this new and collected, is confronting what it means to live in a time ravaged by COVID, by the isolations through which we were forced to put ourselves, in which we endure without our choosing. And so much of the language in Nomenclature is not what you would expect in the most thrilling and startling way. I found myself turning often to the dictionary to discover things about chemical terms, geographical ones, how electricity works. But all of these things in Nomenclature attend very precisely to how we are living, how we are not thriving, and what we could do better, how we could be better. How did language find you in Nomenclature?
Okay. Nomenclature, as you say, I wrote during the pandemic, or during that period of the pandemic. I don't think we're out of the pandemic. We are a product of the pandemic, perhaps. Yeah. It was a time of a kind of stillness that the world had to cease what it was doing at the time, right? And everyone had this stricture. Maybe billionaires flew here and there, I don't know. But we stood still suddenly and had to observe each other. But some of us, in a sense, were always standing still observing what was going on in the world. But now the others had to do it too. Yeah? And I thought it was a real moment, a time of deep reflection. The possibility for deep reflection existed. Of course, after capital kind of gathered itself back up and tried to figure out, well, how do we use this? How do we make money out of this stuff? You know, including the vaccine, including so many things. Then the world sped up again, and with even more rapacity and rapidity. But so the poem came out of that. And then, so during that period, I wanted to examine, okay, what do we actually consist, and who is we? Not something that had been unavailable, but something that the moment called for deep reflection on. And I thought, so the language of the poem is full of scientific language. And I thought, but we do live in scientific language. You know, look at the back of any product that you buy and read it. And that is what we are living, and that is what we are ingesting. But we do not speak it. And I wanted the poem to speak that language, to actually show us what we do not want to see. That is, that we've all become, in a kind of way, we become kind of immune to what we are being sold, what we are being given to eat, what we are being told to consume, right? And we are also told that poetry ought not to use this kind of language. Poetry ought to use a certain kind of bucolic language, right? Talk about birds. Well, actually, we hate birds because everything we do is to destroy them, right? So they can no longer work as metaphor for anything, right? So I wanted to say then in the poem, the metaphor is the chemistry, the metaphor is the science, and how it has been used against us. And so those are the words now we must put in our mouths and speak them and be uncomfortable with them. So the work is full of that language. I wanted to live in the language that we live in. Like, stop making jokes about, beauty and the natural world, which we are killing, and let us confront, our shape, which is often ugly.
And to speak of animals, there is something more than a little Ouroboratic, that image of the snake that bites, or if you like, kisses its own tail, in the way that nomenclature is shaped and formed. It ends with Ossuaries, which is itself also a long poem in which the speaker of that poem, Yasmin, confronts a landscape of extreme violence and how we museum that violence, how we curate it and station it to be appealing, perhaps in service of our best natures. And then, of course, we begin with nomenclature. Was there this feeling of traversing in a way that felt cyclical at times with the building of this work?
Say that again.
Circles and cycles. Was there anything in Ossuaries that felt like it spoke to nomenclature? And vice versa.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Perhaps. Because one lives in one's head and one, follows a thought. I think that Ossuaries, there's a figure in Ossuaries who is in the distant future, looking back at the present, and remarking on that present. So the figure in the future is looking at us all as bones in an ossuary, right? Indiscriminate bones in an ossuary, what we've become, yeah? And the figure in the future is saying, I wish I could send a letter back to my early self in the past, to think about what these things might have been and might have done. In Ossuaries, what I was playing with was that three-line stanza, the kind of tension of a three-line stanza, and how you could fill that space with anything, and how you could move inside of that space. When I was writing Ossuaries, I was listening to John Coltrane's Venus, which is like an 8-minute piece and it's a conversation in a way between John Coltrane and Rashad Ali, the drummer, and I hope I've gotten his first name right, and this incredible dance between them, trying to hold themselves on the earth, but flying off, and in a sense beginning in a certain melodic shape, and then breaking that melodic shape and blowing it out into the stratosphere, out into the world, and I loved that piece, and I wanted to make a piece like that in words, right? That kind of tension, blowing out against this little ball of mud we're all spinning on here, right? So that was the job, the task of that poem, what would it be if we were far ahead of ourselves? Like, what is the world we would want to make? But more importantly in that poem, what is the world that we had died in? Yeah.
And there's a great deal of returning in the poems themselves, but also in the act of housing them, in thinking of how they would live together in this collection. And in the notes that you've generously shared at the end of the book, you've mentioned in some of the earlier collections, returning to them with a kind of attentiveness that respects as they were when they were first published, but also goes into them, as Dionne goes into them, to make touches. It's kind of like visiting a house that you built 20 or 30 years ago and rearranging some of the furniture so that it suits the habitation of what it's become. Let's talk about rehousing some of the poems in those earlier collections to be assembled here.
There was only one book that I went back to and thought, I don't think that line works, you know. That was a little overdoing. And that was in Primitive Offensive. That was my first book. When I went back to look at them, because you go back and you look at your work and you think, okay, is this still okay? And I thought, so my excesses, I took out some of them in that book. But then I looked at winter epigrams and epigrams through Ernesto Cardenal in defense of Claudia, and I kind of thought, okay, you're okay, you can stay. And a beautiful thing happened around those poems. A colleague of mine where I taught at the University of Guelph was going to Nicaragua at a certain point and took a copy of winter epigrams and epigrams to Ernesto Cardenal and gave it to Ernesto Cardenal. And Ernesto Cardenal was, of course, a poet, but was also the Minister of Culture in the Sandinista government in the late 80s. And then Cardenal wrote his memoir and said that, he used to be a poet, and the only person who remembers may be this poet from this poet from Canada who wrote to his poems, right? And I just love that, So in that one, so this is another way of moving through the poem. So Primitive Offensive was a hard poem to write, and so then I wrote the winter epigrams, which are short and pithy and hopefully humorous, because I needed that release from that earlier, long work of doing Primitive Offensive. And so that followed there. What was the next one? I can't remember.
Next we had Chronicles of the Hostile Sun.
Oh, Chronicles. Well, Chronicles came out of Grenada. So I was in Grenada in 1983 during the revolution, and I had gone there to work in the revolution. And, frankly, it was, I say it's the best year of my life because I learned so much there. And it was wonderful to go there and work in your politics, right? And work toward a socialist future, if you will. And sadly, the revolution failed and the Americans invaded, and my colleagues and I were evacuated about the 4th day of the invasion. And it was devastating for me at the time, really, and still is. It lives as a devastation in me forever. Because we were working so hard to do something. And so that poem, see how I stopped there? That's what that does to me all the time, even 40 years later, right? So that book came out of there, about how small a thing one desires, called something like freedom. Something like the absence of coloniality, something like the absence of racism, something like the absence of, virulent capital, and it can be, that's a really small idea, but it can be crushed immediately. Yeah. So that was that book. And then, what was the next one?
No language is neutral, and perhaps by this point the edits had sort of tapered off.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The only really one that I went back and kind of, like Kamau Brathwaite, took that away and took that away was because he believed in rewriting, and and I took that as, okay, I'll do that. And so the thing moved. Land to Light On, I think, was next, and So I went back and looked at them all, and I thought, okay, I can live with these. I can live with this book as a collection, as a collected, yeah.
I mean, so much of the work that Nomenclature, for the time being, and the 8 other collections in this body do, is to directly address the extractive, particularly the ways in which the black body was extracted, manipulated, coerced. And so many of Dionne's poems are confronting what is being taken from us all the time. What are we sometimes dangerously complicit in letting people take from us? And so I wanted to remark on this, Dionne, and also to say, what was it like to reinfuse the planes and surfaces of those poems with a responding energy, to confront that extraction, and then to introduce everything in response to it?
Yeah, I think I say, I have a book coming out soon, is a nonfiction book called Salvage, and it talks about what we've ingested as literature, and how that has made us in the Americas, and how we try to unmake that all the time. But one of the things that I say in that text is that we live in this sensorium of catastrophe, beginning somewhere in 1492, but following and tracing us always. But when I say we live in the sensorium of it, I mean we know all aspects of it. And an important aspect of it is, of course, our hundreds of years struggle to resist it, to resist the catastrophe, to respond to the catastrophe with all of our energies and all of the sort of wealth of our desire to live beyond the catastrophe. That is also the shape of it, And so my poems, and I think, and my work explore these apertures, this response to that, this continuous response to that. And this catastrophe isn't something old, but something continuous. It continues in various forms, right? Various forms of capital. And so, but we continue in various forms, right? And we continue to respond to that and to produce, I think, some magnificent objects and an incredible thought that you can leap that catastrophe continually, right? In another nonfiction book of mine, A Map to the Door of No Return, no, actually, not there, wait. Actually, A Map to the Door of No Return was a kind of investigation of that door of no return as a kind of opening for thinking, right? It is, of course, an opening for enslavement, but it's also an opening for thinking, right? Conceptually, philosophically, it's a place of new thinking, right? One had to be incredibly fabulous to think one's way beyond that dread. But in a book of poems that's not in this collection, because it just couldn't, it's not containable in this collection, The Blue Clerk, I do go to the door of no return. And there's a wondrousness to going to that place where you encounter the figures of all our pasts, and then you realize that you've survived, right? That in fact, millions of people survived that door, survived that space, and what they would have had to employ to survive that space, that had to be a deeply, fecund imagination to survive this and survive this space. And in the new book, Salvage, the nonfiction, we're talking about poetry, but we're talking about nonfiction, okay. I start the book, one of the starts, so the book is in several starts, is in a photograph of me, reputed to be me, and my two sisters and my cousin, and we're in Wong's studio in San Fernando, near the library, near the Indian cinema at the time. And so I read this photograph and all its diasporas, in a way, that have survived that catastrophe. Yeah.
In Ossuary 1, Yasmin tells us, I lived and loved, some might say, in momentous times. Looking back, my dreams were full of prisons. There's a way in which that particular long poem, and so many of these poems, have always confronted how we dishonor our dead, either the dead we have inherited, the dead we try to do right by but cannot, and as we see currently in Gaza and Palestine, the dead which we are complicit in often ignoring despite our best intentions. And Dionne, this book has been published into a resurfacing of that horror that persists in Sudan, Gaza, and Palestine, which was not new, but has been made new again through terror and intense pain. And I wish to speak, or to hear you speak a bit about these bodies that are moving through time and space, in and out of wars, the wars that were the wars you address, and the war of our Anthropocene.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what to say. I can only, in my poems, record those, but also record the continuous recovery that happens, record how we, and in this we, that those are the people I include in this we, how we flee those systems, and how we kind of survive those systems. So I have to also remark in the poems the business of surviving those systems. But I also have to admit in the poems that we live in these times, right? I want to pay close attention in every kind of line that I write about the admission that we live in these times, right? So that's why the poem says, we live in momentous times, ravenous times, my dreams were full of prisons. But then it says, but all our dreams were full of prisons. And then the poems talk about what we wanted to do, right? We wanted to live well. Each night we walk into our rooms and oil our bodies in cardamom as a kind of magic, as a kind of spell against that violence. And I think, I think of people fleeing. For example, I think of people crossing the Mediterranean, and the intense desire in them not to, as the corporate media says, go live a better life, but to live any life is actually what the intention is. Yeah, and I think of the amnesia of that, of corporate media or capitalist forces, their amnesia as to how these things are produced, how this movement is actually produced. Yeah, at one time 500 years ago, they hauled us in ships. Now they push us out into the sea, yeah, in small boats, in which we die. So I just want, that's my thinking life. Yeah, that's who I think with and who I think about. Yeah.
And as I said at the beginning of our time together here with Dionne, this is a shared conversation. At this point, I'd love to open our gathering further. I'm sure some of you with us today have questions for Dionne, comments, passionate declarations to make to her. Please use this time to share your love and admiration. A mic will be moving around. There's a question in the front. It was but a wave.
All has been said. There are no questions.
There's one. One emerged.
Passionate declarations. That's what we need right now. Thank you so much for your work, Dionne. It's what you have done for us as a people. There are no words, really. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it's meant to you to represent queerness and same-sex desire and love. I know many of us, or me, I, queer woman, it's mattered so much. It's given me hope and a space to breathe. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Thanks.
Well, I just wanted to be honest in the work about existence. Do you know what I mean? The thing about poetry or about writing, I think it elicits, it asks you questions too, do you know? And it asks you to be, for me anyway, that it asks me to be completely honest in the space of it, right? And I'm not good at stricture. I think in all of my life I've sort of braced against normativity, right? And I think about how normativity is kind of legalized, yeah, in so many ways. Heteronormativity is a kind of legal construct, not a human construct, right? But a legal construct. It is not about thinking about what and how one desires, or even what desire is. And I brace against that kind of stricture, that kind of legalese, that kind of it's an administrative structure, you know. And it was important to write that down, to think with it, yeah. So I write that woman as that man sometimes in some of the works, because they are. It's a question of just being. and fighting against the structures that enact and enforce heteronormativity. You know, just as I fight against the structures that enforce and enact and legalize racism, you know, and sexism, etc. So that figure that appears in the work as an honest description of the world, you know, an honest description of people, right? And I'm not going to bow to those strictures or bow to that, you know, the legislative forces of sexuality, right? And it appears in the work, and it appears as it is in the world, as a feature of being, as a feature of existence, as a feature of desire. Yeah.
There's a question.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. Really took so much away from this talk. I was really interested when you spoke about science. It sort of reminded me of sort of Sylvia Wynter's work and this idea of the human as being almost described as a sort of scientific being in its current mode of sort of survival of the fittest, taxonomies, classifications, and that sort of stuff. So that was just something that sort of came to mind. I'm quite interested in the connection between activism and poetry in your work. You're a very politically committed poet. You're a revolutionary poet. If you can call you that, given your time in Grenada. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. How important it's been for you to remain politically committed in your work. Some people, would sort of draw a sort of wall between art and activism, for example. So why is it important for you to sort of fuse the two together?
Why is it important for me to
fuse the two together?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know that it's a fusion. It just is, I think. I mean, I think so. I'm paraphrasing and possibly, thirdly, am I still here? No. Okay. I'm paraphrasing and paraphrasing Aimé Césaire, who's misquoting and paraphrasing, that justice stands at beauty's door. I think this kind of division between sort of art and politics is false. And it has an old history. That for me there is no division between art and politics. No, I'm not a politician. Who wants to be one of those these days anyway? But, well, clearly many. But I don't consider myself sort of an activist. You see, we come into this kind of compartmentalizing of everything into these, into these spaces. But I think art's work is to kind of make life good and pleasurable and better. And so if that falls into the category of activism, then fine, I don't call myself an activist because there are activists in the world, right? Right now, there are activists, mounting campaigns against the genocide in Gaza. My dear friend Bev Bain, who is here, has done a lot of work in that way. Angelique here is an activist in many ways around gender and sexuality, etc. So there's a distinction between the activist who does, the groundwork, the campaigning, the getting people out, the coordination of demonstrations, campaigns, etc. Theory, yeah. There are also activists who are academics. There are academics too. There are many kinds of people, is what I'm saying, that come together to make the world we're trying to make, if you will, right? I'm one of those people. And I call myself a poet or a novelist or an essayist, right? So I don't see the division between them, right? I don't make the kind of art to soothe anybody, because I don't think that's the purpose of art. I think the purpose of art is to kind of wake you up, ask you, what's going on here? What are you doing? What are we doing? How are we living, right? To describe that living, that kind of job. So if that's the work that I think art does, I don't think art is a dead thing. You walk into a room, you look at it, oh, nice, and you go, right? Or you read a poem and you say, oh, that's quite sweet. That's the wrong, that's just that's the wrong reaction, So yes, yeah. I don't know if I've answered you properly, but yeah.
So hi, once again. Forgive me if I seem a little bit nervous because I am in front of Dionne Brand and Shivanee Ramlochan and everybody here, so I'm totally freaked out. However, Miss Brand, when we consider that a lot of work in literature focuses on post-colonialism, and when I myself was introduced to your work, it was the map to the door of no return. Your work has been mind-blowing in that it forces ourselves to look at what post-colonialism has brought us to and how do we move forward. So my question is, you focus on that idea of memory and belonging in one sense, but then your work has inspired other writers to push those boundaries. Writers like Professor Kai Miller, who has cited your work as deeply influential to him. So how does that sense of belonging for you, now that you're shifting the narrative from what we were into what we could be and what we can be and what we will be, how do we maintain that sense of belonging? Because there's so many writers that are diasporic in nature, there's so many writers that stay here, that move forward. How do we maintain that sense of belonging as Caribbean people now that we're shifting from being post-colonial, so to speak?
Wow. Well, clearly that's for the whole room to answer, right? That's for the whole room to answer, really. I don't know, you make it as you go along. You make new communities as you go along. As you make new ideas, you make new communities, right? You take people with you as you go, right? So our ever-expanding kind of definition of the human, our ever-expanding definition of what that might be, whether it's, what freedoms are, right? I have a good friend, Ronaldo Walcott, who has a book called The Long Emancipation, right? And he talks about, in that book, about how emancipation qua emancipation is a thing, but not freedom, right? It wasn't freedom, right? It was something called emancipation. It was a kind of bureaucratic process called emancipation, right? But what we are aiming for is freedom, right? So as I say, I think you make it as you go along. You open up the spaces for what belonging is. Like, I think belonging was a certain kind of romantic and sentimental idea, right? And perhaps it's something called something else now, right? Perhaps it's a much more uncomfortable place now. Belonging suggests a certain kind of ease, right? And perhaps what we think through now is how to feel comfortable with dis-ease in some ways, right? With constant dis-ease, perhaps. Not violent dis-ease, but a kind of constant opening and a constant kind of making. Perhaps that new definition we might walk into, you know?
I knew that the declarations would be passionate, and indeed they were. Unfortunately, we are bringing this event to a close, and I'd like to invite Dionne to share one final reading with us.
This is new for me, this. This is a poem that I wrote in November or October, and it's called Prologue for Now, Gaza. And I wrote this poem when some military chief in Israel called the Palestinians human animals. And I was struck, horrified at that, and I wrote this poem. The inconceivable decibels of all the things we've lived before. We've been advised of the quotas of casualty this time. But of all the things I lost when I lost hearing was the sound of human animals. How did you come to be human animals, they asked. We were born, I told them. The regulators and the fascists along each perpendicular with the least time on earth to live signed off on the old fantasies at press conferences. The editors printed their carnage again like welcome news. And I was in a ship again, with none of my belongings except my throat, I tell you. I was limbless and talking. I was going to a funeral every day. It was a TV series and I was human, animal. Call my cell, call me. You'll see the pictures. All of them believe in God, all of them. Billionaires exchanged more than 1,000 emails in their conviction. Text me. They charged my credit card with mourning. I was mourning for 4 years already. And the bank said I should boost my financial wellness, be prepared to face high interest rates. But I am mourning episodically. The undertaker said I should shut the fuck up. Who would love a corpse? I came into the world as a corpse, and now who am I fooling about now anyway? There's famine and phosphorus air and no water. And if you leave the oil in the ground, they say, or in the sea, you will worsen the dirty emissions. And we'll die today rather than tomorrow. Any war is atrocious, except the war they agree to with an agreement. The gates of hell legislation set out the theory along a long beach where who worries about proportion? There were ghost cities with people. There were the usual suspensions of rules at the morgues. Your eyes could be wide open. Everyone could be alive there. Everyone could be walking. Everyone could be upright. Talk to black people. We know. The situation is always devastating. And the armed immortal fence along the borders stretch out into all the seas. This is for the human animals. The new features and the revenues of disappearing, traveling by bombardment, fleeing by oil and gas concessions. No one can defend us. No one did. Some of us are meat like human animals, retrospectively eliminated. I'm too soft on human animals, I know. Generally, shouldn't mourn human animals. There was always the silence of the evacuations. 1.1 million people stretched out along the highway, 1.3 Celsius of human sources warming the planet, the human scientist said. What should I accept and what should I grieve in the consumer price data limping along? The funds predict that growth will slow to 0.7%. What growth atrophies the mind and the fingertips signing all the declarations against the human animals? Remember, some of us know this even longer. If we do this in a formalized manner, you may drink the sewage water, the orders of censors documenting the mouths on these subjects. Here's to what I know, and here's to all my fears. And all our hearts, they say at J.P. Morgan Chase, go out to all who are suffering. 13 billion in profit from July to September, the permitted style of mourning. Drenched in cortisol produced by many animals, we left our coffee behind and the clothes in the dryer, measured but only briefly, who could look up for long? The contrails to the genocidaire tourism, and the politicians embrace and authorize this old wonder of the world, the newest color of the grimmest pink. I've taken this inventory before for all the human animals. Liberal democracy has entirely failed and failed to even hide its fascisms. This narrow path of language leads me here.
Thank you, Dionne, for sharing this language with us, this nomenclature for the time being, and I think for the time to come. It was in 2016 that I sat on the stage across from you, many a year ago. I had no book, but I think the book that I was already writing at the time had filaments and threads and tessellations influenced and hewn by Dionne Brand herself. I am beyond grateful for her. I know we all are as well. Please give her another round of applause.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Shivanee, for this conversation and all the conversations we've had intuitively and affectively. And thank you for your work too. I always enjoy our conversations.
Thank you. I know that you are all going to disobey me, but I'm going to ask you not to storm Dionne with effusion on this stage. Please allow her time to get to the book signing area just outside. I already see the disobedience in many eyes. But the record will state that I did ask. She'll be signing books immediately outside. Get your book signed and come right back here to the NGC Bocas Lit Fest space for quarreling with history starting imminently. Thank you.
Thank you.